What's up, beautiful people? Today we're taking a look at the French and Indian War, a war with a confusing name, because many folks think it's a war in which the French and Indians fight, but nope, this is a war in which the French and their Native American allies will throw down with Mama Country, Britain, and her 13 colonies. First, we always need some context to help us understand what is about to go down. This is North America in 1750, and ever since the founding of Quebec in 1608, the colony of New France was growing in the interior of North America, from present-day Canada all along the Mississippi River to New Orleans. France colonization spread, and this colonization was largely reliant on alliances with native people that took advantage of the very profitable fur trade. Likewise, ever since Jamestown in 1607, the British colonies were established along the Atlantic coast, and they were also growing in their own unique way. Now, looking at the map, it appears France is the big dog in North America. They clearly have the most territory, but size is not everything, because when comparing the population of New France with the 13 British colonies, there were way more British colonists than there were French. By about 1750, there were roughly 70 to 100,000 colonists in New France, and in the British colonies, there are a heck of a lot more than the 100,000 in New France. You can do the math right there. It is also important to note that Britain and France were not only colonial rivals in North America, but also rivals back over in Europe. There was beef between France and Britain over power in Europe, religious rivalry between Protestant Britain and Catholic France, as well as the colonial competition in North America. In fact, these two countries would go through 3 rounds of war, which would begin over in Europe.
Round 3.
But would spread over to the New World. While the first 3 wars between France and England pretty much ended in no clear victor in North America, think of King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's Wars as the prequels. They'll start over in Europe, and then their conflict will spread over to the Western Hemisphere. Now for the causes of the French and Indian War. As the population of the 13 colonies grew, many colonists began to head west looking for new land in the frontier. As a result of this move into the interior, English settlements began to encroach on land claimed by, you guessed it, France and various Native American tribes. It will be this colonial movement into the Ohio River Valley, a spot that was claimed by France, although without a lot of settlers, hard to defend, that will really get this thing started. Now, the French respond to this movement of British settlers in their territory by building forts along Lake Erie and the Ohio River. The French also sought to strengthen their alliances with local Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley, such as the Delaware and the Shawnee Indians, basically trying to prevent them from possibly cozying up to the British. Now, native tribes in this region were also worried about losing their autonomy and their control over their land and their cultural traditions. They saw what happened in the New England region after the events of King Philip's War, in the Chesapeake region after the Powhatan War, and they saw the French control of this region as the lesser of two evils, since relatively few French colonists settled in the region and many tribes had well-established trade networks. New France wasn't all that bad, especially compared to the British. As the French are shoring up their defenses, building forts, the governor of Virginia sent a young dude in his early 20s, you may have heard of him, George Washington, on a road trip to the region. Washington saw that most of the tribes were super tight homies with the French, but the British did have a loose alliance with the local Iroquois Confederation. Remember, the native people are making choices, making moves, and choosing sides as well. Now, the stuff hits the fan when shots are fired at the French by an Iroquois individual who happens to be homies with the British, and French reinforcements swoop in and defeated your boy George Washington's crew. And that, kiddos, is how we got ourselves a war. Quick summary of the causes: you have historic rivalry between Britain and France. As we've seen, they have on numerous occasions competed politically, economically, and even militarily. And underlying this tension is the fact you have a largely Protestant Britain and their 13 colonies competing against Catholic France for control over North America. But the immediate cause of the French and Indian War will be the conflict over this disputed territory in the Ohio Valley. Now that we have a war, we need to be able to fight this bad boy. And one of the first things the British needed to do was to see who was going to have their back. This leads us to the Albany meeting in New York in 1754. And at this meeting, there are 2 main goals. One, make sure the 13 colonies are united in the cause against the French and their Native American allies. And the other, perhaps even more important goal, is to try to get some Native American groups on the side of the British. The Iroquois Confederation is quite powerful. They've been around for a very long time, and they have an interest in the British fighting the French and their Indian allies. Why would they have an interest in all these white people fighting, you say? Well, many of the tribes allied with the French, like the Huron Indians, were enemies of the Iroquois Confederation. So this meeting is called at Albany to try to accomplish these two goals. At the meeting, another individual you may have heard of, Ben Franklin, developed the Albany Plan of Union to help coordinate troops and collect taxes. This was an effort to promote colonial unity against the French and to help out the British. Now pay very close attention. This proposal is significant. These colonies have no real history of working together, no real shared identity, except a mother country that has largely left them to do their own thing, solitary neglect, hashtag deadbeat mother country. So trying to get them to unite is a significant and bold move. It is in this context in which we get this gem of a political cartoon called Join or Die. The cartoon was designed to get the colonies to support the Albany Plan, but to quote the famous saying, Albany, we have a problem. The plan never comes to fruition due to the lack of support from individual colonies. Each colony had their own interests, and many felt the events unfolding in the Ohio Valley had nothing to do with them. Just another European war, European beef. That's not the colony's problem. In spite of this colonial reluctance to band together, the French and Indian War would begin in 1754, and unlike the first three wars between the European rivals, this one starts on North American soil. And if you're Britain, you really think the colonies should help out because they're a big reason the war's going down. Now, as for the actual war, we're going to keep it short and sweet. Britain gets some early wins in the conflict. They defeat French forces in Nova Scotia, but largely the early rounds of the war go to France. The British general Edward Braddock is unable to take control of the French Fort Duquesne. Braddock is killed. George Washington barely makes it back to Virginia with his own life. So the British and the colonists are retreating. The French are holding their ground. In 1756, the French and Indian War spreads to Europe, where it will be known as the 7 Years' War, with fighting taking place not only in North America, but also the Caribbean, West Africa, even in India. This bad boy is a world war, starts in North America, but quickly spreads. Now, this meme is not exactly historically correct. This was not the French flag in the 1750s, but if the French have way less people in North America than the British, and France has a reputation for losing wars, perhaps a little unfairly, how in the heck are the French winning in the early part of the war? And the answer to this question is actually pretty simple. They have the advantage of having most of the native tribes in the region on their side. They also have some solid French military officers, and they know the interior of the continent better than the British military, so early on they are winning this thing. Now for the spoiler, but you had over 260 years to hear about this outcome. How do the British actually win? And basically a guy by the name of William Pitt over in England dumps a ton of money into the war effort. He mobilizes the British Navy to blockade the French from resupplying their troops in the Western Hemisphere and sends boatloads of British troops, something like 30,000, to go do the fighting in North America. These bold moves get the very powerful Iroquois tribe, which was initially very non-committal, to join the British war effort to help out against the French. Pretty soon, the French abandon Fort Duquesne, which will be renamed Fort Pitt in honor of William Pitt and his role in helping the British win the war, and eventually this area will become known as the city of Pittsburgh. And you could see the site of the old fort right there, with downtown Pittsburgh right behind it, and right to the left is the site of where the world's greatest football team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, play at Heinz Field. Now, there are all sorts of other crazy things that happen. Smallpox does a number on a bunch of the pro-French tribes along the Ohio River. There's some stories about blankets being intentionally given by the British to the French and their native allies. And by 1760, British forces took control of Quebec, the site of the first French colony in North America. Sporadic fighting would take place both in the colonies and the various other theaters of the war, but in 1763, this thing is done. Now for the effects. And in this video, I'm only going to get into a few of them, and in the next video, we will break down the others, but the biggest amongst them can be captured by this song. Now, if you can read or speak French, feel free to sing along, but it's basically this. Let it go. The French are going to have to let go of their North American empire. With the French defeat, this effectively eliminates Britain's main rival in North America. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1763 and would have a number of significant consequences. First, France would lose all of its North American territory. You could see it on the map on the right. It's pretty dramatic. Britain acquired all of New France's territory. Everything east of the Mississippi River was Britain's. Canada was Britain's. The Ohio Valley was Britain's. This is a huge gut punch for France. Now, deep thought time with Mr. Jocz. Sometimes when you win, you really lose. And while the French and Indian War and the subsequent Treaty of Paris was a win for Britain, there are going to be some repercussions from this victory with regard to their relationship with the 13 colonies. And that brings me to the context around Pontiac's rebellion or Pontiac's War. Remember, the war started over a dispute in the Ohio River Valley, and now that the French were kicked out, numerous British colonists wanted to move west into this territory. Guess who will not like this plan? Yup, many of the Native American groups who were allied with France during the war definitely don't want these British settlers encroaching on their land. They lost their ally, the French, and the European leaders in Paris just handed over what is basically native territory to the British. They didn't have any say in this, and they fear that Western expansion by British colonists is going to be devastating for their own autonomy and independence. And as a result, Pontiac, who was an Ottawa chief, forged a Western Confederation of a bunch of tribes in the region and rebelled against colonists who he feared would encroach on their land. This rebellion was a pretty big deal. Before the end of 1763, Pontiac's rebellion led to the death of roughly 2,000 English colonists and the seizure of some important British forts, and some colonists take matters into their own hands. You got a group of people known as the Paxton Boys. These are largely Scot-Irish settlers from western Pennsylvania who basically go on a killing spree, just attacking any native person they see in the region. They and other colonists felt the British government was not doing enough to protect them, so they basically took matters into their own hands, killing a lot of random Native American people, whether or not they had anything to do with Pontiac's rebellion or not. Now, in order to crush the rebellion, Britain had to send additional troops, and eventually the British military was able to suppress the revolt, but it quickly made them realize while they may be the victor of the French and Indian War, governing this land, paying for the war, and a whole host of other challenges remain. These concerns led Britain to pass something known as the Royal Proclamation Act of 1763. And in order to prevent any more native revolts, the British government passed this proclamation, which basically said,
Warning. You are entering a restricted area.
You're not allowed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains. No further colonial settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists were not terribly happy about this British law, and many of them openly disobeyed the order and went west anyways. To many colonists, the French and Indian War, was won so that they could get rid of the French presence and get them access to this land. Britain's mind, this war was won largely without the colonists' help, and they are deeply in debt, and they just had to save their butts from the rebellion known as Pontiac's Rebellion. We are going to find out how all of this turns out in our next video, The Road to the American Revolution. Darn, that's kind of a spoiler. I promise you it's way more complicated than it sounds. Thank you so much for watching. Have a beautiful day. Peace.